Welcome, weary traveller, to a quiet corner of history where the weight of the past settles upon us like a cooling blanket. Tonight, we do not explore the noise of battles, but the subtle, persistent burdens carried within the minds of men, the fragile egos, the deep-seated fears, and the universal, desperate need to appear strong when deep down they felt anything but. Beneath the glittering, opulent surface of the Belle Époque, a deep collective anxiety was building, an invisible tension that sought only the slightest spark to ignite. It wasn't powerful armies that started the war, but the systemic paranoia that infected the thrones and chambers of Europe, driving men toward a conflict they desperately sought to avoid, yet were too proud to stop. Find your most comfortable place, let your breathing deepen, and allow the tension in your shoulders to dissolve entirely. As the sun sets on that lost summer of 1914, we begin our slow, introspective journey into the whispers of the past. May these stories bring you peace and rest. Imagine the Kaiser, Wilhelm I of Germany, not as the bombastic, strutting figure history often remembers, but as a small boy in a quiet, privileged Prussian nursery. He carried a deep, lifelong psychological wound that was rooted in the physical. His left arm was withered, shorter and often functionally useless, a tragic result of a difficult breech birth that severely damaged the nerves. This profound physical difference became his defining psychological affliction, a constant nagging source of insecurity. Every single act of his adult life, from his meticulously tailored, rigid military uniforms that were specifically designed to conceal the injury, to his aggressive, often shockingly erratic foreign policy statements and impulsive diplomatic gestures, was a desperate, loud form of overcompensation. It was a panicked attempt to constantly prove his strength, his completeness, his undeniable masculinity, to a world he deeply feared judged him weak, incapable, or inadequate. His mother, Empress Victoria, the formidable daughter of Queen Victoria, relentlessly subjected him to painful, ultimately failed medical treatments, instilling in him a deep, festering resentment and a constant, crushing pressure to succeed, to be the most powerful monarch in Europe. This intense personal need to outshine his British cousins, particularly the older, more stable King George V, fueled his most expensive and controversial project, the building of the German Navy. Critically, this challenge was less about cold, strategic necessity and more about familial rivalry and a psychological need for validation on the grandest, most visible global stage. On June 28, 1914, when his only true ally, Austria-Hungary, faced profound humiliation after the Sarajevo assassination, Wilhelm saw an immediate, clear reflection of his own youthful insecurity and fear of abandonment. To let Vienna look weak was, in his mind, to admit his entire alliance system was weak. He impulsively gave Austria-Hungary the infamous blank check, an unconditional, reckless guarantee of military support, effectively handing the steering wheel of the continental crisis to Vienna and the desperate men who waited there. In that moment of profound, overzealous confidence, the German Kaiser took the first fatal step toward conflict. We now visit Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, the silent, gilded and increasingly lonely prison of Emperor Franz Joseph I. At the advanced age of 84, he was no longer a contemporary ruler, but a living, suffering relic of the old world, a man whose entire 7-decade-long reign had been relentlessly defined by successive, staggering personal and national losses. He had witnessed his brother executed, his only son committing suicide, and his beloved wife assassinated. Now his only remaining successor, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was also brutally and publicly gone. Franz Joseph was profoundly psychologically exhausted, consumed by one simple overriding desire to preserve the final dignity and legacy of the ancient Habsburg dynasty. For him, the punitive war against Serbia became less about modern, complex geopolitical strategy and more about securing a definitive, honourable and dignified final act to his long, deeply troubled reign. There was simply no room left in his heart for further diplomatic compromise. His primary emotional drive was a profound sense of Verlust, accumulated grief and a burning need for immediate redress. The old man, weary of managing the endless, intractable contradictions of his sprawling, multi-ethnic empire, sought a quick, decisive action to reclaim the lost imperial glory and silence the internal nationalist forces that relentlessly threatened to tear his house down from within. He was acting not as a cool, calculating statesman, but as a grieving, emotionally spent patriarch. The old emperor's profound grief and desire for a final, violent dignity paved the way for the severe ultimatum that would land on Serbia's desk in just 2 weeks, with the Kaiser's backing ensuring it would be non-negotiable. The meticulous, vanity-driven stage manager of the initial escalating crisis was Count Leopold Berchtold, the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister. Berchtold was, by all historical accounts, a man of slight intellect, overwhelming personal vanity, and a profound interest in his own elegant appearance, rather than the crushing gravity of his immensely important office. His desperate, overriding ambition was his most critical psychological weakness. For years he had been widely mocked in the influential Viennese press as indecisive, weak and ineffective, a politically devastating label for a man whose entire self-worth was inextricably tied to his public perception. The assassination presented him with an almost irresistible opportunity to instantly shed this devastating image and secure his place in history as a resolute, unflinching defender of the Empire's honour. Berchtold became entirely consumed by the need for decisive action, a powerful psychological imperative to prove his many detractors wrong and silence the critics who questioned his nerve. He was the single most forceful and urgent advocate in Vienna for the drafting of the severe, impossible ultimatum to Serbia. He pushed for it because he was desperate to prove himself a strong leader. His psychological journey in July 1914 was one of pure, disastrous overcompensation. A small, insecure man trying to publicly embody the force he internally felt he lacked. The ultimatum he designed was a deliberate provocation, creating the critical document that would advance the crisis, one crafted to be absolutely rejected. The Austro-Hungarian ultimatum delivered to Serbia on July 23rd is a masterpiece of psychological warfare and deliberate provocation. It was designed by Berchtold and Hötzendorf not as a document for negotiation, but as a demand for absolute public humiliation. The terms were so punitive, so deeply intrusive into Serbian sovereignty, demanding Austrian officials be allowed to enter Serbia to conduct investigations, that its rejection was a political certainty. The psychological goal was clear: to force Serbia into a position where it must either surrender its national identity or reject the terms, thereby giving Austria-Hungary the moral pretext for a swift, punishing war. When Serbia accepted all but one point, making major concessions, Vienna dismissed the acceptance out of hand. Why? Because the war party was no longer driven by the desire for justice. They were driven by the psychological need for punitive vengeance and total dominance. Anything less than Serbia's total political capitulation was considered a failure. The ultimatum was a fatal diplomatic act designed to shut down all rational discourse and initiate a conflict based purely on the prideful demand for utter submission. This reckless act of pride instantly alerted the continent's largest empire, Russia, which felt it had to respond or lose all standing. We turn now to St. Petersburg, to the quiet, almost suffocating melancholy that constantly haunted the soul of Tsar Nicholas II. If Kaiser Wilhelm was defined by his aggressive, externalized ego, Nicholas was defined by a crippling sense of inadequacy and a profound psychological paralysis of will. He was a man utterly, tragically unprepared for the crushing, overwhelming weight of leading the Russian Empire. Nicholas was a gentle, deeply religious man who sincerely preferred simple family life, quiet gardening, and small, predictable domestic routines. The vast, chaotic, and often brutal demands of millions of restless subjects terrified him, inducing a constant state of internal withdrawal and denial. His unique psychological burden was the profound paradox of absolute power held by a hesitant, weak-willed, and fundamentally shy man. When the July crisis erupted, Nicholas was torn between two impossible duties: defending Russia's ethnic kin, Serbia, or facing the terrifying ghost of a disastrous, unwinnable war leading to a bloody revolution. His mind became a chaotic battlefield of conflicting duties, protector of Slavdom versus protector of his own fragile dynasty. His personal weakness, ironically, proved to be the greatest force multiplier for destruction, as his paralysing indecision created a vacuum that allowed the militarists to seize effective control of the state's direction. Now we watch the agonising internal conflict of Sergei Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister, a man caught tragically between the immense, irresistible currents of Russian militarism and his own sincere, frantic desire for continental peace. Sazonov's inner conflict stemmed directly from the impossible, paradoxical situation he faced. Russia had to stand up and openly defend Serbia to maintain its honour and standing among the powerful pan-Slavic nationalists, a seemingly non-negotiable nationalistic requirement. However, he knew with absolute terrifying certainty that authorising full mobilisation would instantly trigger German counter-mobilisation and an inevitable, massive world war. He spent the final days of July constantly pleading, mediating, frantically arguing and weeping at the flood of incoming telegrams. His psychological state was characterised by a profound sense of learned helplessness, the agonising realisation that his vast diplomatic skill and appeals to reason were utterly useless when confronted by the overwhelming mechanical momentum of military mobilisation. He was forced to watch his own vast country move inexorably toward war, not because he willed it, but because he was psychologically unable to contain or stop the tidal forces of pride operating beneath the weak Tsar, setting the stage for the final, fatal mobilisation order. Let us reflect on the core cause of the speed of escalation: the mobilisation timetables. These were not merely logistical documents, they were psychological constructs, monumental efforts to impose perfect, predictable order onto the chaos of modern industrial warfare. The generals who authored them, particularly in Germany and Russia, were operating under an illusion of perfect control. For decades, they worked on these complex railroad schedules, perfecting the transfer of millions of men and thousands of tons of equipment. This intense focus created a psychological blindness. They began to believe the timetable was the reality, and that politics and diplomacy were mere obstacles to its smooth execution. Once the first train left the station, the plan was deemed sacred and irreversible. The deep-seated fear of chaos and the professional pride in their complex logistics superseded all political judgment. This collective psychological adherence to the timetable, the belief that the military machine must run flawlessly, forced the political leaders to declare war at the precise moment the schedule demanded. This illusion of control made it inevitable that when Tsar Nicholas finally signed the mobilisation order, Germany would be forced to react instantly, as their own timetable was equally rigid. General Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, the highly intellectual, deeply serious and famously highly strung chief of the German General Staff, represented the psychological burden of professional military focus taken to an utterly destructive, fanatical extreme. Moltke's entire professional and personal identity was almost mystically wrapped up in the Schlieffen Plan, Germany's detailed, rigid and inflexibly timed blueprint for fighting a two-front war against Russia and France simultaneously. The plan was not merely a document to him, it was a sacred, almost religious text, demanding that if Russia began to mobilise its massive army, Germany must instantly attack France first. In the final, chaotic and terrifying days of July, political considerations finally began to clash violently with the rigidity of the plan's timetable. The Kaiser, in a moment of genuine panic, momentarily suggested focusing only on the Eastern Front. Moltke suffered an immense visible internal conflict, almost collapsing under the sheer psychological strain of the proposal. To alter the plan meant admitting that his years of work, his professional existence, and the entire logistical structure of German military readiness might be flawed. His psychological struggle was one of severe cognitive rigidity. He vehemently, tearfully, insisted that the plan must be executed precisely as written, not because it was the best political choice, but because it was the only way to avoid the organisational chaos and personal professional failure he dreaded. The general's professional rigidness became the straitjacket that ultimately bound the fate of Europe to the dictates of an aggressive, inflexible military timetable. First, the invasion of France. This single, dominant psychological theme permeating every level of government in Berlin during the decade leading up to 1914, and Moltke's rigid thinking was the intense, crippling paranoia of encirclement. This fear was visually reinforced by the geopolitical reality of the Triple Entente, a seemingly hostile ring of powers composed of France, Russia, and Great Britain, that appeared to be deliberately closing in on Germany's borders. Fueled by this anxiety, German foreign and military policy became both fundamentally defensive and fiercely aggressive simultaneously, a dangerous mix. Every alliance, every colonial agreement, every naval build-up between the Entente powers was viewed not as a defensive measure on their part, but as a deliberate, insidious attempt to stifle German ambition and ultimately destroy their nation. This collective psychological state of pervasive victimhood led directly to the rigid, preemptive adherence to the infamous Schlieffen Plan, which was based entirely on the necessity of immediate, preemptive aggression. The German General Staff genuinely believed that war must inevitably come, and their only option was to strike first. This deep-seated, self-fulfilling prophecy of fear turned the concept of national security into a perpetual state of exhausting hypervigilance, making rational, measured diplomacy utterly impossible in the final days of July. Their fear of being surrounded forced them to begin the invasion of France, violating the neutrality of Belgium. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, was a man of profoundly reserved temperament and a deep, inward-looking nature. His inner life was one of quiet melancholy, perhaps stemming from the profound personal tragedies he had endured. His approach to the July crisis was defined by a cautious blend of avoidance and moral detachment. Britain was not formally bound by treaty to France or Russia, which initially gave Grey the psychological luxury of acting as the disinterested, detached mediator, positioning himself above the continental squabble. He repeatedly proposed international conferences and mobilisation freezes, attempting to apply calm, logical, English reason to a crisis that was instead driven by highly charged, raw European emotion. Yet his very hesitation and prolonged neutrality proved to be a critical, fatal contributing factor to the war's outbreak. Kaiser Wilhelm II and Count Berchtold, desperately seeking any confirmation of their hopes, catastrophically misinterpreted Grey's lack of immediate firm commitment as definitive confirmation that Britain would, in fact, stay out of the continental conflict entirely. Grey's attempts to soothe the situation were simply too tentative, too measured, and critically, too late to alter the course of the rapidly accelerating militaristic timetables. When he finally realised the true gravity of the German plan to violate neutral Belgium, his reserved demeanour finally broke under the weight of the moral decision, cementing Britain's inevitable entry into the massive, now global conflict. President Raymond Poincaré of France carried the deep, unhealed psychological scar of the 1871 Franco-Prussian War, the devastating defeat by Prussia and the subsequent humiliating loss of Alsace-Lorraine. His entire political and personal life was defined by one overriding primary drive: national vengeance and unbending defensive resolve, a political philosophy known in France as revanche, revenge. For Poincaré, 1914 was not a political choice to be debated or avoided. It was the inevitable, long-awaited and necessary moment to restore France's lost honour and decisively right the historical wrong. When he visited St. Petersburg just before the crisis reached its critical point, his message to the Russians was deliberately clear and psychologically reinforcing. There would be absolutely no backing down or compromise. He instilled in the hesitant Tsar and his ministers the absolute need for firm, unyielding resolve, thereby significantly strengthening the Russian militarist's hand at the crucial moment of decision. Poincaré's mind operated with an iron certainty and a singular focus that contrasted sharply with the paralysing indecision of Nicholas and the careful hesitation of Grey. His deep-seated conviction guaranteed that if Germany mobilised, France would instantly stand ready for war. His steadfastness, born of decades of simmering national humiliation, acted as an emotional lock, completely closing off any remaining French path toward conciliation or last-minute diplomatic withdrawal, ensuring France was a willing, determined combatant when the German armies finally moved. We must not overlook the 19-year-old trigger of the entire crisis, Gavrilo Princip. His psychological journey was one of intense, passionate, and ultimately tragic idealism, fueled by profound desperation. Princip belonged to Young Bosnia, a revolutionary, highly radicalised group driven by the intoxicating mix of nationalist fanaticism and profound personal inadequacy. He was chronically poor, sickly, frail, and felt utterly insignificant in the vast, impersonal and uncaring Austro-Hungarian Empire. For him, assassinating a high-profile figure of power offered the only conceivable path to eternal significance, a way to transcend his own frail mortality and become a historical martyr for Serbian greatness and the South Slav cause. His act was not a piece of cold, calculated state policy, but a desperate, final, ego-driven plea for recognition, cloaked in the grand, sweeping language of political ideology. He genuinely believed his single, impulsive action would instantaneously liberate millions of people, failing entirely to comprehend the complex, suffocating web of treaties and the structure of imperial pride that his single bullet would immediately unravel. The very act of the assassination, clumsy and unplanned as it was, introduced the critical, destabilising element of pure chaos, the unpredictable spark that allowed the deep-seated paranoia of the great empires to finally explode into the open. His final impulsive act directly set the stage for Austria's desperate decision to send the humiliating ultimatum. Ironically, the man whose death caused the inferno, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was arguably the biggest psychological and political threat to the very war machine he unwillingly ignited. He was known throughout the imperial court as a prickly, fiercely unpopular, and highly complex figure, often deeply disliked by his peers for his temper and progressive views. Yet paradoxically, he was a firm and vocal advocate for a trialist solution, a radical, peaceful internal reform that would elevate the Slavs to equal political footing alongside the Germans and Hungarians within the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire. This political move was the one diplomatic manoeuvre that might have peacefully diffused the intense Serbian nationalist threat by removing its primary grievance. His psychological burden was his profound contradictory nature. He was a conservative Habsburg who wanted radical internal reform, a rigid imperialist who deeply mistrusted and hated the military's excessive power and influence. His death, therefore, did not remove a warmonger. It tragically removed the only major figure in Vienna with the political will, intellectual clarity, and foresight to effectively avoid the looming conflict. His assassination was treated not as the tragic loss of a potential reformer, but as a welcome symbolic defeat of the empire that instantly demanded immediate violent retribution. His final, profound absence was instantly filled by the eager, vengeful, and profoundly short-sighted figures who craved war for their own emotional ends. We now direct our focus to General Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, the chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff, the ultimate symbol of militaristic fervour in Vienna. His entire psychological framework was defined by a desperate, almost pathological attachment to the idea of the offensive as a panacea for all political ills. He had been fanatically advocating for a punitive war against Serbia for years. His psychological profile was clearly marked by an intense, all-consuming martial romanticism, a deeply held, almost mystical belief in the purifying, regenerative power of war, despite his military's actual, demonstrable lack of readiness. For Hötzendorf, war was not merely the extension of politics, it was the definitive, cathartic answer to every internal political and ethnic problem, a swift way to instantly restore the empire's masculinity and erase the perceived stain of weakness. When he finally received his coveted chance in July, his desire for decisive, aggressive action was so overwhelming, so consuming, that he willfully disregarded all caution regarding the precarious logistical realities, the exhaustion of the troops, and the guaranteed, likely devastating reaction of the massive Russian Empire. His psychological urgency, this profound internal need to fight, made him absolutely deaf to all external caution. He successfully convinced the weary Franz Josef that anything less than total, immediate war against Serbia would represent an unacceptable, final national humiliation. His personal hunger for glory led the empire to prioritise military action over diplomatic reason, ensuring that the slightest rejection of the ultimatum would trigger the final fatal mobilisation. Let us reflect on the Serbian response to the ultimatum. Serbia, a small, strategically vulnerable nation, gave a reply that was hailed internationally for its extraordinary conciliatory dignity. They accepted virtually every major demand of the humiliating ultimatum, demonstrating a profound desire to avoid war and avert the crisis. Yet, they refused the one clause, allowing Austrian officials to conduct investigations on Serbian soil as a non-negotiable infringement on their sovereignty. This refusal, though small, was a crucial act of psychological and national self-preservation. To have accepted the entire ultimatum would have been a complete political and national surrender, an admission that Serbia was nothing more than an Austro-Hungarian puppet state. In the context of the region's intense nationalism, their leaders chose to defend the last bastion of their national dignity, knowing full well the price would be war. Their refusal was precisely what Vienna's war party, led by Berchtold and Hötzendorf, needed. It was treated as the moral pretext for the immediate final declaration of war, setting the chain of mobilisation in motion across the continent. The final, frantic and critical days of July were psychologically defined by a profound and overwhelming phenomenon, the acceleration of panic. The major decision-makers across the continent were separated by thousands of miles, relying on slow, manually coded, often easily misinterpreted telegrams that created severe communication delays. The resulting time lag, the 12 to 24 hours between sending a message and receiving a reply, created a fatal echo chamber of fear, misjudgment, and preemptive action. A severe threat issued one day might take a full day to be processed and officially responded to, during which time the initiator might have already further escalated their own position, driven solely by their own overwhelming fear of the anticipated delayed counter-response. In this terrifying diplomatic vacuum, the pre-programmed speed of military mobilization constantly outpaced the natural, laborious slowness of negotiation and diplomacy. Human reflection and careful consideration were effectively replaced by frantic, mechanical reaction. Leaders, gripped by the palpable fear that they would be late to the fight, that their enemy would seize a critical logistical advantage, acted precipitously and defensively without waiting for confirmation. The crisis was not a series of calculated, cold decisions, but a blur of anxious, panicked reactions. The urgent, primal need to act and show resolve superseded the higher wisdom to wait and negotiate, proving that in a crisis of ego, speed is often the enemy of peace. This speed led directly to Austria-Hungary's final irreversible step, the declaration of war on Serbia. On July 28, 1914, 4 weeks after the assassination, Austria-Hungary officially declared war on Serbia. This act was the psychological Rubicon. Up until this point, the crisis was merely diplomatic and political. With the declaration, it became a military one. This final choice was driven entirely by the war party's intense need to assert dominance and honour over the quiet voice of reason. Vienna knew that if they hesitated any longer, international mediation might take hold, or the Kaiser might change his mind. Their decision was a desperate, immediate and preemptive move to ensure that the conflict was purely military and beyond the reach of diplomacy. For the war party, the immense psychological relief of taking action, of moving from weeks of agonizing tension to the certainty of conflict, was palpable, overshadowing the horrifying reality of what they had unleashed. They had traded anxiety for destiny. This single declaration instantly forced the most decisive actor of the entire Entente into action: Russia. The declaration was the precise trigger that put the massive, slow, and irreversible mobilization process of the Tsar's army into motion, setting the stage for the final, global confrontation. The climactic moment of Russia's general military mobilization on July 30th was the ultimate, final psychological submission to the timetable. In the rigid military doctrines of 1914, mobilization was universally understood to be an act of war because the sheer logistical complexity, the astronomical cost, and the immense time-consuming nature of the process meant it could not be recalled or stopped without catastrophic organizational chaos and profound, unforgivable political humiliation. For Tsar Nicholas and his generals, the choice in those final hours was tragically narrowed not to do we go to war, but rather do we look disorganized, weak, and politically chaotic by halting this immense process, or do we proceed directly to war in an orderly, professionally commanded fashion? The latter option, despite its horrific known consequences, was paradoxically and psychologically far easier to accept. It offered a return to professional military order, discipline, and a clear, albeit terrifying, path forward from the paralysing anxiety of diplomatic uncertainty. The decision to mobilise was the collective final submission of political will to the administrative, rigid logic of the General Staff. The crushing anxiety of uncertainty which had dominated the whole month of July was at last replaced by the terrifying but simple certainty of conflict. Once the orders were transmitted, the fates were sealed, and the political decision-makers permanently surrendered their power to the military timetable. This Russian action instantly triggered Germany's final desperate counter-mobilization. The blank check, Germany's reckless pledge of unconditional military support to Austria-Hungary, remains a fascinating and utterly disastrous study in psychological overreach and catastrophic impulse control failure at the highest level of state. Why would Berlin, a major, sophisticated European power, effectively hand over the steering wheel of continental peace to the desperate, weaker, and highly unstable state of Austria-Hungary? The profound core answer lies in a single paralysing German fear, the fear of alliance contagion and the even deeper fear of utter isolation. The German leadership was genuinely terrified that if they failed to support Austria-Hungary unconditionally in this critical moment of crisis, Austria would immediately seek a new, powerful partner, thereby leaving Germany strategically isolated, surrounded, and confirming their worst national fears of total encirclement. The blank check was, therefore, a deeply panicked, ego-driven attempt to project an image of unshakable strength, fidelity and resolve, masking a profound underlying insecurity about their actual geopolitical position in Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm II, driven relentlessly by his personal need to prove his loyalty, signed away his country's most crucial freedom of diplomatic action. It was a profound, catastrophic failure of foresight and calculation, motivated not by cool, long-term strategy, but by the short-term, overwhelming emotional need for affirmation as a faithful, powerful and reliable ally in a world they perceived as hostile. This early pledge made Germany's later, inevitable declaration of war on Russia and France a foregone conclusion. The final, desperate flurry of telegrams between Kaiser Wilhelm II and Tsar Nicholas II, the infamous Willy-Nicky correspondence, is a tragic historical example of a dialogue of the deaf. The two cousins, communicating in the last hours before mobilisation, were attempting to find a personal solution, yet each was utterly trapped by his own military schedule and psychological perspective. Nicholas pleaded for Wilhelm to mediate. Wilhelm pleaded for Nicholas to halt mobilisation. They talked past each other, unable to grasp the political and military realities of the other. Nicholas, constrained by his generals, could not halt his army without total political collapse. Wilhelm, constrained by the Schlieffen Plan, could not mediate without destroying his own war strategy. The telegram showed two men with good personal intentions, yet profoundly impotent to stop the machine they had collectively built. Their failure to truly hear and trust one another, their inability to transcend the psychological barriers of their national roles, proves that even direct communication can fail when ego, fear, and inflexible plans have already predetermined the outcome. We now turn back to Paris and the all-consuming national feeling that drove French decisions, the burden of national honour. Unlike Germany's paranoia or Austria's desperation, France was motivated by a deep-seated historical trauma and a collective psychological need for redemption. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871 had left a raw, open wound on the French psyche, transforming a desire for security into an obsession with revanche or revenge. Every political figure, every general, and indeed the public, felt intense pressure not to repeat the humiliation of 1870. The psychological trap was set. Any diplomatic concession to Germany, any suggestion of non-mobilisation, would be viewed as a betrayal of the national martyrs and a repeat of that historical shame. This fear of humiliation became a more powerful motivator than the fear of war. The political system was psychologically incapable of accepting a non-military solution once Germany began mobilising because the national self-image required them to stand firm, resolute and demanding of their lost territory. The weight of this national narrative, the story that France must reclaim its honour, forced them to accelerate their response. French resolve was not born of military strength, but of the strength of their collective wound, ensuring that when Germany's final war declarations came, France was already mentally and emotionally prepared to fight. Let us now descend into the murky, conspiratorial, and feverishly passionate world of the Serbian secret military society, the Black Hand, the organisation that was the direct mastermind behind the assassination. This group, led by the fanatical and ruthless Colonel Dragutin Dmitrievich, known by his chilling codename Apis, operated on a terrifying psychological principle of paranoid certainty coupled with revolutionary zeal. Their members believed with unshakable, zealous conviction that a final, existential war with the hated Austria-Hungary was not merely possible, but absolutely inevitable and divinely ordained. Therefore, they reasoned, only by aggressively striking first and seizing the military initiative could Serbia fulfill its destiny as the unifier of all South Slavs. Their collective, rigid and secretive mind was psychologically impermeable to doubt or negotiation. They were the true shadowy architects of Princeps assassination, meticulously using the young, susceptible idealist as a willing, disposable tool to ignite the fire and force the hands of their own government. Their deep, pervasive paranoia was highly infectious, successfully convincing many key figures within the Serbian military establishment that Austria was planning an imminent, devastating attack. The Black Hand demonstrates with chilling clarity how a small, ideologically rigid, and deeply motivated group, operating entirely in the shadows of power, can effectively inject a lethal dose of fear, certainty, and political violence into the delicate international political bloodstream, setting the initial destructive event in motion. One of the most profound and dangerous psychological errors committed by every major capital in 1914 was the widespread, comforting, collective delusion that the war would be decisively and gloriously over by Christmas. Across the war rooms of Paris, Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, strategists and politicians suffered from a collective, convenient historical amnesia. They willfully forgot the recent brutal lessons of modern industrial conflict, such as the American Civil War and the bloody Russo-Japanese War, which had unequivocally demonstrated the horrific, devastating killing power of modern machine guns and artillery. Generals across Europe romanticised outdated concepts like swift cavalry charges, ignoring the defensive dominance of new weaponry. This pervasive delusion was psychologically necessary and profoundly comforting. It provided the critical mental space that allowed leaders to justify their high-stakes, risky decisions by dramatically minimising the projected human and financial cost in their minds. For the public, the irresistible promise of a short, glorious war allowed for an explosion of enthusiastic, patriotic fervour. The belief in a quick, triumphant victory profoundly lowered the psychological barrier to engaging in continental war, replacing reasoned caution and diplomatic prudence with a reckless, short-sighted enthusiasm that ensured no leader felt pressure from the public to seek peace. Let us pause for a moment to allow these intense individual narratives to gently settle within our minds. We have seen the stressed minds of a few crucial men, but the true sweeping tragedy of 1914 lies in the collective mind of the continent, a psychological terrain saturated with systemic fear and competitive pride that had been festering for generations. Before the crisis, Europe had enjoyed nearly a century of relative, though restless, peace following the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars. Yet this extended period of stability, fueled by rapid industrialization and colonial expansion, paradoxically bred a deep-seated anxiety, the fear of the zero-sum game. This was the fundamental, toxic psychological belief held across all major capitals that the world was a finite cake, and any political, economic or colonial gain by one nation must necessarily come at the immediate expense of another. Britain feared its naval dominance slipping away to the ambitious German fleet. Germany feared being starved of resources and global influence by its established colonial rivals. Austria feared its own demographic and political collapse under the weight of restive national groups. This pervasive systemic paranoia led inexorably to the formation of the two great, rigid, and ultimately unforgiving alliances, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, Great Britain, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy. These alliances, though rationally designed with the initial intent of ensuring peace through overwhelming mutual deterrence, had the precise psychological opposite effect. They created a profound chain of insecurity, where any localized conflict, such as the one we just witnessed in Serbia, was instantly magnified into a continental threat. If massive, slow-moving Russia mobilized its army, Germany felt compelled by the rigid logic of the Schlieffen Plan to mobilize instantly and attack France first. Crucially, once the dominoes began to fall, no leader felt they could back down without appearing to abandon their primary ally. In the toxic, honour-obsessed culture of the time, this backing down meant political suicide and national humiliation, the ultimate psychological fear of the proud statesman. Furthermore, the incredible technological advancements of the Second Industrial Revolution played a particularly cruel psychological trick on the military leaders. The generals had spent decades perfecting mobilization schedules that were viewed as infallible, mechanical solutions to any political chaos. The belief in these precise, complex schedules was a form of profound technological hubris. The mistaken idea that the horrific, unpredictable complexity of modern warfare could be perfectly controlled by an army's immutable timetable. Once the initial order to mobilize was given, the machine was psychologically perceived as unstoppable. The stage for this disaster was not set by widespread poverty or utter despair, but by excessive pride and overwhelming material prosperity. Europe was too rich, too powerful, too confident in its global influence, and too utterly convinced of its own moral and strategic righteousness. This collective state of national narcissism ensured that when the unexpected tiny spark of Princeps' bullet landed, no single leader possessed the necessary humility or the sheer moral courage to prioritize measured de-escalation over the perceived imperative of national honour. It was, at its deepest core, a profound failure of collective empathy, a conscious refusal by every major decision-maker to truly imagine the devastating, prolonged cost of a war they all privately feared. The world's great powers had meticulously built a machine of annihilation, and in July 1914 they all collectively decided that the overwhelming fear of looking weak was a greater, more intolerable threat to their personal and national egos than setting that immense, terrifying machine in motion. We are witnessing the collapse of diplomacy under the weight of accumulated psychological baggage. If these quiet, introspective explorations of history's psychological turning points offer you a path toward greater peace and deep relaxation, I warmly invite you to join our growing, thoughtful community of listeners. Subscribing to Whispers of the Past ensures that you receive these deep dive narratives regularly, offering you a gentle intellectual journey to soothe a restless mind each week. We believe that truly understanding the complex, flawed human soul, even those souls who made catastrophic errors, can bring us closer to our own inner calm and acceptance. Consider joining us. Let the weight of the past lighten the often heavy burdens of your present. Your sustained support helps us continue to share these quiet stories, guiding you toward a more thoughtful and ultimately restful night. Count István Tisza, the Hungarian Prime Minister, stands as the poignant, tragic figure of the July crisis who represents the ultimate defeat of the unheeded inner voice of reason. He was the only major powerful figure within the unified, war-eager circles of Vienna and Budapest to initially argue strenuously and logically against an immediate punitive war with Serbia. He warned with chilling prophetic clarity that such a move would inevitably, and quickly, lead to a catastrophic, unwinnable war with the massive Russian Empire. Tisza was a pragmatic, deeply conservative statesman whose psychological drive was solely focused on political survival, internal stability, and meticulously preserving the delicate balance of the dual monarchy, not on emotional vengeance or abstract imperial honour. Yet, despite his initial, clear-eyed realism, he was ultimately and completely overwhelmed by the surrounding pressure. He was silenced by the overwhelming weight of the German blank cheque and succumbed to the unified ego, moral force, and persistent badgering of the Austrian war party, who relentlessly painted him as a coward and an obstacle to imperial dignity. His terrifying fear of being politically isolated, of being publicly deemed a traitor to the Hungarian cause, became psychologically stronger than his internal rational certainty that war was a terrible mistake. His story shows how easily individual reason and caution can be entirely crushed by the overwhelming psychological pressure of collective national fervour, a pressure that led to his final, reluctant approval of the war. The 48-hour deadline attached to the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum serves as a chilling case study in imposing pressure and forcing recklessness. The purpose of the ridiculously short deadline was fundamentally psychological: to prevent mediation, deliberation, or cooler heads from prevailing. By restricting the response window, Austria-Hungary deliberately induced a state of diplomatic panic across Europe. Ministers were forced to make life-and-death decisions under intense time pressure, with inadequate information and without the time necessary to consult allies and formulate coordinated responses. This deadline was a calculated move to benefit the aggressor, who had already finalised its plans, and cripple the defenders, who were caught off guard. The psychological effect of the deadline was to prioritise speed and reaction over caution and reason, forcing Russia and Germany to focus on their military mobilisation timetables rather than diplomatic cables. The deadline was the mechanism that stripped away the ability of statesmen to reflect, transforming the final days of July into a chaotic sprint toward war. We must examine the role of the press in the July crisis, which acted as a massive psychological amplifier, turning anxiety into hysteria. Newspapers across all capitals, Vienna, Berlin, Paris, St. Petersburg, were deeply nationalistic and fiercely competitive. They were not merely reporting the news, they were actively manufacturing consent for war. The psychological effect of the hyper-partisan press was the creation of a collective state of war fever. In Austria, the press demanded vengeance for the assassination. In Russia, the press played up the defence of Slavic brotherhood. In Germany, papers fueled the paranoia of encirclement, warning the public that a preemptive strike was necessary for survival. This relentless, one-sided narrative severely limited the emotional and political space available for compromise. By the end of July, public opinion, fueled by sensationalist, fearful headlines, became a massive psychological force that the political leaders could not ignore. The fear of being seen as the statesman who sold out the nation was too powerful. The press, appealing to the most primal fears and vanities, ensured that the door to peace was slammed shut by the collective will of an inflamed public. The infamous decades-long naval arms race between Great Britain and Germany highlights the powerful and ultimately destructive role of status anxiety in escalating the crisis. For Britain, naval dominance was not a mere policy choice. It was an existential, non-negotiable necessity, the absolute cornerstone of their national identity, their massive global empire and their island security. The very concept of rule over the waves was woven into the fabric of British identity. Germany's determined public decision to build a massive high-seas battle fleet capable of challenging the Royal Navy was therefore seen by the British establishment not merely as a strategic development, but as a deliberate, egregious insult, a direct psychological challenge to the very definition of British global power and national existence. The immense psychological impact of this challenge ensured that when the July crisis erupted, the British public and government were already entirely conditioned to view Germany not as a potential partner, but as the primary, aggressive, and existential threat to their way of life. This powerful pre-existing anxiety made it virtually impossible for cautious statesmen like Sir Edward Grey to view German actions in 1914 with any genuine neutrality. The costly naval race had already poisoned the well of trust. This ensured Britain's entry into the war, once Belgium's neutrality was violated, was a swift, almost emotionally driven and predictable outcome of accumulated psychological grievance, rather than a purely logical strategic decision. Let us consider King George V of Great Britain, a figure rarely at the centre of political decisions, but deeply burdened by a unique psychological stress. The anguish of the family man at war with his own cousins. George V, Tsar Nicholas II, and Kaiser Wilhelm II were all grandsons of Queen Victoria, linked by blood and personal history. George V saw the coming conflict not just as a political alignment, but as a tragic, impossible family quarrel. He struggled immensely with the reality of fighting Willie, Wilhelm, and possibly sending Nicholas, to his doom. His psychological state was defined by moral conflict and personal powerlessness. He and his advisors tried desperately to mediate the conflict through personal familial telegrams, appealing to their common grandmother's memory and late-night calls for reason. Yet, the vast, impersonal forces of geopolitics, the naval race, the alliance timetables, the fear of German domination, overwhelmed all familial bonds. When he finally signed the order to declare war, it was done with a profound sense of resignation and personal tragedy, knowing he was sanctioning the destruction of his own family line across Europe. His anguish was the personal cost of the crisis, a quiet reminder that the war was a tragedy of egos that failed to respect the bonds of shared humanity and kinship. Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, Germany's civilian leader, is the figure who embodies the statesman's despair in the face of military dominance. Unlike the Kaiser and Moltke, Bethmann-Hollweg was a man of culture and intelligence who understood the catastrophic nature of the coming war. His primary psychological flaw was his profound inability to confront authority. He lacked the political nerve to stand up to the Kaiser or the powerful general staff. After issuing the blank cheque in a moment of panic and loyalty, he spent the rest of July desperately trying to slow the momentum, realising his error. He sent confused, contradictory messages to Vienna and London, attempting to mediate the crisis he'd helped start. His famous diary entries from the time reveal a man consumed by self-loathing and a terrible certainty of ruin. He felt trapped by the military's rigid timetable and the Kaiser's impulsive decisions. His tragedy is that he was smart enough to see the cliff, but too weak-willed to put his foot down and stop the nation from marching over it. He was a spectator to his own political destruction, a man whose inaction was as fatal as the actions of the extremists. The most damning psychological failure of the July crisis was the collective ego, the shared, pervasive inability of all major powers to accept external mediation. Sir Edward Grey repeatedly proposed a conference of ambassadors in London, a classic diplomatic mechanism designed to find compromise. Every major leader rejected this proposal. Austria-Hungary refused, stating its honour was involved and no one should interfere. Germany refused, fearing a conference would delay the Schlieffen Plan and allow Russia to mobilise fully. Russia refused to compromise on its role as the protector of Serbia. Every rejection was a choice made to protect a fragile national ego over the collective well-being of Europe. The very act of sitting down to talk was psychologically perceived as weakness and compromise. This shared refusal to submit national pride to international arbitration was the final, fatal choice. They preferred the risk of mutual destruction to the certainty of perceived humiliation at the conference table, sealing the fate of the continent and leading directly to the final devastating declarations of war. Finally, we must consider the overwhelming public war enthusiasm that swept across all European capitals in early August. This sudden, almost euphoric explosion of patriotic fervour was the ultimate psychological release of tension. For decades, Europe had lived under the suffocating weight of the arms race, the military timetables, and the constant fear of the inevitable war. When the declarations finally came, there was a sense of relief. The terrible waiting was over. The conflict was immediately romanticised as a great adventure, a glorious cause that would finally purify the nation and give meaning to the industrial age. Young men rushed to the colours, genuinely excited to participate. This overwhelming public reaction served as a final psychological validation for the leaders. The people, they reasoned, wanted the war. This collective psychological relief ensured there was virtually no public dissent or opposition once the conflict began. The immense war machine operated without political constraint. This collective submission to fate allows us now to turn inward, reflecting on how we too can manage the crushing anxiety of waiting and uncertainty without resorting to catastrophic action. The deep darkness of 1914 has settled now, and we are left with the silence, the profound stillness of a world forever changed, not by grand strategic genius, but by the private, anxious, and deeply flawed fears of a few men in positions of ultimate power. But as reflective historians of the human soul, we must gently ask, what does this tragic story of ego, fear, and insecurity whisper to us, here in the quiet solitude of our own lives? Take a slow, deep breath in, filling your lungs entirely, noticing the coolness of the air as it enters, and release it slowly, deliberately, allowing your entire attention to rest upon the concept of ego and its destructive power. The monarchs and ministers of 1914 were so completely preoccupied with the appearance of strength, so utterly terrified of being publicly perceived as weak by their allies or their enemies, that they chose continental catastrophe over the simple, peaceful option of political compromise. In our own lives, how often does a small ego wound, a fear of being wrong, a stubborn refusal to apologize, a burning, obsessive need to win a simple, meaningless argument, escalate a conflict in our personal or professional spheres, costing us our peace? These powerful leaders could not back down from a petty national quarrel because the perceived humiliation was too great a threat to their carefully constructed self-image and their grip on power. Now, let your own need to be absolutely right, your own fear of looking weak or unsure, simply float away with your next deep cleansing exhale. You're safe here in this moment, held gently in this quiet space. You're strong enough to let go of the relentless need to prove yourself and simply rest. Feel the ground beneath you supporting you completely. Now, let us turn our minds gently to the pervasive role of paranoia. Germany was convinced it was maliciously encircled and would be attacked. Russia was convinced it would be politically betrayed by its allies. Austria was convinced it would internally collapse. This systemic collective paranoia created a dangerous situation where every defensive move by one power was instantly, aggressively interpreted as an offensive move by another. We too sometimes allow an inner paranoia to cloud our daily judgment and disrupt our sleep. We imagine hostile intentions in the simple, neutral actions or words of others, a look, a silence, a delayed response, creating unnecessary stress and anxiety where none was truly intended. Let the heavy, anxious feeling of anticipated conflict within your own mind begin to soften, to dissipate now. Imagine the rigid, tense borders of your personal anxieties dissolving into a calm, open, featureless field of soft grey. The world around you, especially in the quiet darkness of night, is often much quieter, much less threatening than the fearful internal narratives we spend so much energy constructing and maintaining. Let the silence speak to you now, not of threat, but of peace. Now, let your mind gently focus on the final tragic image, that of the great military machine. The leaders of Europe were fundamentally trapped by their own elaborate, over-perfected and irreversible plans, the mobilization timetables. They felt utterly powerless to stop the machine once the first gear was set in motion. This is the profound psychological danger of letting process and routine overwhelm purpose and wisdom. In our busy modern lives, we often feel trapped and utterly exhausted by routines, commitments, and deadlines that were initially meant to serve us, but now relentlessly demand our complete energy and attention. Close your eyes, if you haven't already, and picture that relentless, anxious machine of your own daily schedule grinding to a slow, silent, and comforting stop. Imagine the hands of the clock slowing down, the ticking sound fading away completely. Remember that you hold the ultimate power to step off the schedule, even if only for this night. Your single, most important purpose right now is simply to rest and find deep, restorative peace. Allow the historical figures we met tonight, the anxious Kaiser, the indecisive Tsar, the grieving Emperor, to gently fade away into the distance. They were men ultimately defined by the same universal feelings we carry: fear, ambition, pride. but their collective inability to manage those feelings on a global scale cost a generation its future. Their story is a gentle but firm reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the wisdom and moral clarity to choose the peaceful path, even when the insecure ego screams for vengeance or affirmation. Rest now in the deep, calming knowledge that your own mind is your greatest empire, and your most vital act of strength is choosing peace within it. Let the soothing rhythm of your own breathing guide you deeper into calm. Feel the muscles in your jaw loosen, your forehead relax, and the weight of your eyelids grow heavy. You are drifting. Drifting. As our quiet journey through the fragile mind of 1914 finally concludes, carry this single, soothing thought into your quiet night. The greatest and most destructive conflicts often begin not on massive, distant battlefields, but in the small, anxious whispers of the insecure soul. The paranoia that tragically gripped Europe was ultimately the fear of change, the profound fear of irrelevance, and the absolute fear of letting go of control. Now, you have the profound, absolute permission to release all such fears. Let the powerful, dramatic stories of the past drift entirely away like slow-moving clouds in a peaceful, darkening sky. You are safe, you are secure, and your day is completely done. As the final echoes of history fade into silence, let your mind settle into the deep restorative peace that awaits you. Drift now into the quiet, into the calm, into a gentle and profoundly restful sleep. Good night.